What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about something that I see a whole bunch of online. People asking questions about it. People just seem to be, especially like newer guitar players, seem to be a little unclear about this topic. So I'm going to try to, in a very condensed way, explain it and make it a little easier to understand. And what we're talking about is ohms. So what are ohms? So ohms are basically, in kind of a condensed definition, it's just a unit of electrical resistance. So why is this important? Because if you have a tube amp, you have to be very specific about the ohmage. The ohms need to match the cabinet. If they don't, you can start to have issues with your amp. So if you've come from, say that you're a new guitar player and you started out with maybe like a solid state amp or a digital amp, ohms isn't really an issue there. But say you finally you bought a tube amp, especially like a half stack, like a head and a cabinet, something that's separated, and now you have all these inputs, or outputs rather, they're outputs, not inputs. You have all these outputs on the back of your amp, and they say different things: 16 ohms, 8 ohms, 4 ohms, or it's a switch. There's all kinds of stuff, right? And you're like, what does all this mean, And then you have your cabinet, and your cabinet has multiple inputs on it, and you're like, I don't know what's going on here, right? So we're going to try to kind of explain some of that and clear some of that up, and just, that way you don't hurt your brand new expensive tube amp you just got. Okay, so this is my main amp, a Marshall JCM 2000, and here are the different speaker outputs on the back. So what does all this mean? So the cabinet I use is a 16 ohm cabinet. So this seems pretty simple. We got a 16 ohm output, we got a 16 ohm cabinet, we just match them up. We take a speaker cable, we plug it in here, we plug it into the input of the cabinet. So I don't have the cabinet in here with me, unfortunately, but the cabinet has 2 jacks on it, and one of them is a stereo jack. So it has like a switch and stuff on it. So I don't use that. I use it mono, running at 16 ohms, and it's just out of here, into there. That's it. So if you're just using one cabinet, that's pretty basic. And then we got these over here, the 8 and 4 ohms. So this is kind of how ohmage divides down, right? I run out of the 16 ohm to my 116 ohm cab. Everything's great. Say I wanted to run another cabinet. Right, so say I got another Marshall cab that was the exact same cab, and it's also 16 ohms. So what I would do then is I would come over here to this switch, make sure it's on 8 ohms, and then I would run out of these 2, one to each cabinet. Now, the amp is going to be operating at 8 ohms, and it's running into 2 16 ohm cabinets, which divide down to 8 ohms, and everything matches, and we're good to go. Now, let's say you have a different kind of cab. Say you don't have a Marshall cab. Say you have something that's at 8 ohms. The one cab is an 8 ohm cab. Well, you would just make sure that this switch was at 8 ohms, and you would just run out of one of these to that. Good to go, right? Now say you have 2 8 ohm cabinets and you want to run them both. Well, you come over here to the switch, you switch it over to 4 ohms, you plug into each of these, you're good to go. So it's really not as difficult as it might seem, but if you've never had to deal with it before, it can be kind of confusing. What I see is a lot of people just don't understand how the division breaks down. They think it goes the other way. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who think this, that they think it goes the other way. They're like, oh, well, I've got 2 8 ohm cabs, I should run it at 16 ohms. It's like, no, that's the opposite of what you're thinking. It divides down, not up. So you're at 16 ohms, you want to divide it down, it goes to 8 ohms. 8 ohms, you divide it down, it goes to 4 ohms. that's really all there is to it. Every amp is going to be different. Not every amp is going to have a switch like this, or different jacks. For example, let's take a look at this guy right here. My little orange micro dark. You can see on the back of it only has this one 8 ohm output. Now, the neat thing about this amp is a hybrid amp. It's solid state. So this says a minimum 8 load. So solid state's a little different. Solid state amps aren't nearly as finicky as tube amps are. So since this has a solid state power amp, it just has this one speaker output with a minimum of 8 ohms. What that means is that you can't run 4 ohms off of this amp. So if you had two 16 ohm cabs, you could plug one into there, and if your other cab had like parallel outputs, all parallel means is that they're the same, they do the same thing. So if you had a cabinet with parallel outputs, you could do what we call daisy chaining, and you could just come out of the one cabinet into the other, and this amp would still be fine because it would be running at 8 ohms. But if you just have one 8 ohm cab, you can only run that one cab off of this amp. You can't run 2 of them because it would drop it to 4 ohms, and it would put a lot more stress on the power amp, and you would start to run into problems there. So every amp's going to be a little different. I know this is something that we all hate to do, but you can always refer to your owner's manual if you're unclear. But if you're buying a used amp, sometimes it's not an option, but you can always look it up online. But that's basically how ohms break down. And it's really not as complicated as it might seem at first. Alright guys, so that's the ohm breakdown. Like I said, really not super complicated, but if you've never had to deal with it before, it can be a little confusing. So hope that helps. Hope that clears some things up about ohmage and tube amps and all that kind of stuff. So hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave me a comment. I guess to just kind of summarize it all, the reason this is important is because you can damage your amp. You can damage the transformer, you can damage the power tubes, you can damage all kinds of stuff in a tube amp if the ohmage isn't matched up correctly. It's not like an immediate thing. It's not something that you'll notice the moment the moment you are like mismatched. But over time, it will cause unnecessary stress on the amp. And if you just keep doing it and keep repeatedly doing it, it will eventually start to cause you problems. So if it's something that just kind of happens one time and you notice it, don't freak out. No reason to freak out. Just switch it, make it how it's supposed to be, and you'll probably be fine. So, thanks for watching, and I'll be back next week.